All right, thank you. Well, I do appreciate everybody being here this morning. So I was asked to talk about residents, families, and guilt. Oh my, because that is certainly a topic that comes up over and over. So I am a licensed professional counselor and I am a certified grief therapist. Whenever we are talking about guilt and placement, this is one of the topics that does come up over and over and over again. And I actually have an entire program that I talk about that I titled, But I Made a Promise. And so I took some of my slides from that and kind of created this. So Susanna, if you'll go ahead and go to that next one, and we'll look at our learning objectives. And we're going to talk about ways to cope whenever we do have to break that promise, and then talk about the difference in guilt and remorse, and then about some self-forgiveness. If you'll go ahead and go to that next one. So I made a promise. Typically, whenever we're looking at placement, we had the very best of intentions whenever we made that promise to a family member. And we meant it when we said it. Our promise was one that we made in good faith. We may have thought at the time that we could keep our loved ones at home because we would just get some extra help. We would use adult day programs. We would use respite. And we likely had no idea how expensive adult day programs or respite healthcare was going to be. We also, when we made that promise, we've got to keep in mind, and as we talk to family members, this is the main thing here, because we're going to be the ones talking to family members because they have all this guilt. We based it on the information that we had at the time, and we were sincere based on the information that we had at the time. But because of circumstances, our loved one, their loved one, is not in the same place now. Things have happened, either due to just normal aging or due to something like dementia. And when you made that promise, when you made that agreement with them, they may very well have been active, healthy, and of sound mind. And you may have just said, oh no, I would never place you in one of those places in a nursing home. But you had no way of knowing what was going to happen in the future and what was going to happen with you or with them. Okay, go ahead, Susanna. We also didn't realize the strain that it would put on our relationships as we were starting to take care of a loved one. And I always say one of my jobs here is to take care of the family members. So the statistic is that 68% of the time, a spouse who's taking care of a loved one that has dementia, a spouse is going to pass away before the person with dementia does. The latest statistic on adult children is that 63% of the time, an adult child will die before their parent from the stress of taking care of their parent. But we don't know that until we get right in the middle of it. And then as the healthcare professionals, those family members are the ones coming to us with that guilt. They're still trying to work. They're still trying to be a spouse. They may have had kids boomerang back home. They may still have kids at home. They may be raising grandkids, and they're trying to be a full-time caregiver. Things change. And no matter what, we end up having to make some hard decisions. Life gets in the way and life goes on, and especially if there is a disease involved. We also, when we made a promise, when families make promises, they very likely thought it could ever get that bad. My mom, my dad, my husband, my wife, they wouldn't ever get that bad because my mom would never wander off. My dad would never hit. My husband would never, because they don't understand disease processes. And again, I put it in bold on this slide. They based it on the facts and beliefs that they had at the time. Now, big talks that we have with families. We have visions of nursing homes from that word nursing home. I bet that I could just say the word nursing home, and many of us can smell and see a nursing home from the past. We could close our eyes and I could say, think of a nursing home, and you can see the bright lights and you might can smell either the urine or the disinfectant. We've got that idea of the nursing home. And I always remind those families, that's not where you placed them. That's where you promised you wouldn't place them. Those were the crowded, smelly places before regulations went in. And you promised not to put them there and you didn't. Okay, go to the next slide. But of course there's here's those pictures. That's the place we didn't put them. Here's the place we put them, that other picture where people were sitting there with their music on. And who wouldn't want to be there? Those ladies are having fun. Okay, go ahead and go to that next one. Guilt. I hear this word probably more than any other word, either in the one-on-ones that I do with families or in the support groups. But I feel guilty. I feel guilty. I feel guilty. And I work an awful lot with family members about the word remorse. And we're going to talk about remorse in just a minute. Because think about that word guilt. When do we hear guilt? Don't you think of a courtroom? People are found guilty. Guilt comes from that. And how many of us in healthcare have heard these words? I should have been able to. I should be able to take care of them. But we all have our limits. Now, there's several reasons that families will start to feel guilty. And we've got to keep this in mind, working on this end of it, being on the healthcare end of it. Sometimes they feel guilty because they place them and they start to improve, or they appear like they're improving and they go, well, what was I doing wrong? It wasn't that they were doing anything wrong, but they're placed and they're with their peers and we've got a team of people taking care of them. They may feel guilty because they feel like they're being judged by others for placing their loved one. And then there's that guilt, especially if they feel a sense of relief after placement and they don't have anybody to talk to about that. If they're not in a support group, they don't have that safe place to come and go, oh, I slept last night and it felt so good to be able to sleep last night. I didn't have to get up with them. I'm not having to do tons and tons of laundry. That guilt. I had a family member who had moved her bed in front of the staircase and was sleeping on a bed in front of the stairs to keep her husband from going up the stairs in the middle of the night. I had a wife who was sleeping on the floor beside her husband's bed so that when he got up, he'd step on her and wake her up so that she'd know he was up. Because that's all she could think to do. She was so tired. And then she felt guilty when she placed him. Some guilt is very, very normal, but I talk with families about being careful about those woulda, coulda, shoulda statements and having those sneak up on them. Let's go to the next slide. So we talk a lot about guilt versus remorse and being careful with those words, because guilt is something that a fact of having committed a specific offense. We spend a lot of time talking about guilt in support groups, but remorse is kind of a regret for a wrong committed. and starting to change those words using that cognitive behavior therapy, reframing thoughts. Just think about what remorse is, what they are feeling, what family members are actually feeling is remorse over something they wish they'd done or not done, said or not said. So I encourage them to call it what it actually is. It's not guilt, it's remorse. And they seem to be able to live a little better with that word remorse. I have remorse over the fact that rather than guilt. They can handle that word a little bit better. It sits a little better with them. And then to have a professional come alongside, to have us come alongside them and say, chances are that you did the very best that you could at the time with the facts and the knowledge that you had at the time. And reminding them that hindsight's very different from foresight. And then throwing that back out. Is this remorse or is this guilt? Okay, let's go to that next slide. When we hear the word grief, typically in our society, when we hear the word grief, we think death. And as I've studied grief and have learned more and more about grief, grief is just a response to loss. Now let's throw a pandemic in on top of this. This is a topic I've been asked to speak on over and over. Yesterday, I did a big program, Area Agency on Aging, on ambiguous grief and anticipatory grief. We are all right now in a sense of collective grief because we are all grieving the loss of normal. And we're still in this messy middle right now. This is not new normal. We know that. But when are we going to get there? I don't know. It's changing every day. We were just saying earlier as we were kind of chit-chatting, it changes every day. Well, let's add some dementia to that, or let's just add an aging loved one to that. So when we have residents in nursing homes and assisted livings, those family members are going through grief. And if we will start to look at it as that and help them call it grief, it really helps when they realize that grief is normal and grief is expected, and allow them to start calling it grief. But that bottom bullet point there, one of the biggest challenges after placement is learning to live separated from a loved one, but still being a part of their life and learning how to manage that. Okay, let's go to that next slide. So how do we start to deal with the guilt and the heartbreak of that? One of the first things is that we've got to start helping our families be very gentle with themselves. We have no control over the level of care that our loved ones are going to start to require. We do the very best that we can at home for as long as we can, but eventually they probably are going to need more care than we can provide, and we have no control over that. I also always encourage them to be really careful with their self-talk and to make sure that they are talking to themselves the way that they would talk to a close friend. Working on self-talk and stopping the negative voice. If they hear themselves starting to talk to themselves in a way that they would not talk to their best friend, to stop it. And to continue to go back and remind themselves that they honored the spirit in which they made the promise, even though they had to break the promise. Okay, let's go to the next slide. If you're the one who's talking with the family member, and again, those family members tend to come to any of us that might have on that name tag or have on those scrubs, I think it's important that we not just kind of push that off to the side and tell them things like, you know, you did the best that you could, but really encourage them to get into a support group encourage them to really work through the feelings that they're having, because it's some legitimate feelings when you do stop and you look at those statistics. I looked in the face of an adult daughter after she placed her mother. I was walking her out to her car and was saying, we've got her now. You get back to being the daughter. And she had a stroke looking in my face. So our caregivers, we've got to start taking care of our caregivers as well. There's not enough beds in the United States for everybody who needs a bed. There's sure not enough beds in the United States for everybody that has dementia. Reminding them that they did make that promise at a time that was very different from the reality of today, and that they had no idea to know where a disease or just that aging family member, where it was going to take them. They didn't abandon them. They took care of them in the very best way that they knew how to take care of them. And the reality was, what that promise actually was that they vowed to provide them with the very best care in a comfortable setting. And that they're doing that. They're making sure that they're taken care of, and that is what caregiving is all about. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Also encourage them to always trust themselves, that they did their research before placement, that they did not rush into their decision, that they educated themselves, that they learned what they needed to know, and that they made the best choice for their loved one and for their family member. And that they didn't second guess themselves. And then, really important, that they give themselves permission to feel and experience those emotions. We are so bad in this country about seeing someone who's crying and running up to them and going, oh, no, don't cry. Here, let's do some. We don't want people to cry. We don't allow people to feel emotions. We need to feel those emotions. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be angry. It's all right to feel that, but we need to call it what it is. We need to be able to say, I'm mad because I'm sad, or my anger is actually from the fear of, but learning how to handle and deal with those emotions. In therapy, we talk about if you can name them, you can tame them. Working through emotions. Okay, let's go to the next one. I've got some references here. Some that I've used in this program. I've also got some books on here. I put a couple of books on here also to use with children and with youth for whenever there's placement that happens and you're needing to talk with children or with teens and help them understand what might be happening with their loved one. All right. Thank you, Susanna.